There's an awful lot of paper here, sister. This is good for a couple of hours, I think, but, oh, I see. But at any rate, what I need to do is to let you know how we came on to Sister Marilyn. It didn't occur to us, having been here all this time, that we could actually turn to Maine for some resources that we don't have. We don't have a theologian. We certainly have priests, and we could rely on them, but sometimes it's interesting to hear, not necessarily from priests, but for people who actually do this as their research work in the university and the academia. So this particular topic is of real interest to us. I know that there are folks in the audience that really appreciate what Tom Merton did. But I decided to look at the state of Maine, and we actually got a little touch of Maine this year. We got two bookends in the fashion speaking. Today we have Sister Marilyn Sunderman, a member of the religious Sisters of Mercy, and towards the end of the week we'll have Bishop Dealey, and that's all you need to know about Catholics in Maine. Sisters of Mercy and the Bishop of Portland, who in theory, in reality, is the Bishop of Maine. So, as I say, we looked to Maine to furnish us some of the things that we need. Bishop Dealey will be speaking about the Synod 2023. He agreed to do that. It was very generous of him. He'll be saying Mass Thursday morning along with our clergy. And but Sister Sunderman was a real find because she's an expert. She has a varied career. If you had a chance to study her bio, by all means do that a little bit later. I won't go over it because that's your homework. But she's gone the road from elementary school through college. She has degrees that would fill that page if we weren't writing about it in a more sort of a narrative way. It's a real pleasure to have her here today. And Sister Marilyn, let's talk about Merton as the prophet.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And I chose, when I asked what would be my topic, I thought because of our current international situation, especially with Ukraine, that I wanted to talk about Thomas Merton as a prophet of peace. So that's my topic. And of course, we all know who Thomas Merton is, the celebrated Trappist monk, priest, and author of a multitude of books, articles, letters, etc., etc. So let me just begin with this introduction. Regarding Thomas Merton being a prophet of peace, of note is the fact that he contributed to Merton's role of prophet in religion and society. According to Merton, Blake viewed the prophet as a visionary, a seer, who used his or her imagination to gain insight into the signs of the times in our world. By means of his poetic corpus, Blake treated some of humankind's deepest social issues and fulfilled the role of prophet vis-a-vis envisioning a future of peace, love, and justice in our world. Contemporary author Dr. R.S.M notes, quote, over the course of Merton's life, his admiration of Blake's prophetic imagination increased. Blake helped Merton realize that prophetic imagination is an integral component for diagnosing humankind's sicknesses, as well as formulating creative remedies to heal them. End of quote. According to Thomas Merton, the prophet committed to God's revelation is one who speaks radical truth to power. For Merton, the life of the prophet roots itself in contemplation, that finds expression in witnessing publicly to God's kingdom of nonviolence, love, peace, and justice. Attentiveness to the Word of God, Scripture, essential to a life of contemplative prayer, awakens one's prophetic sensibility and inspires prophetic action. Regarding this, Merton insists that, quote, fidelity to God often leads to a marginal existence in which one becomes a sign of contradiction to the values of the world and the misplaced values that may be present in the church, end of quote. In essence, for Thomas Merton, being faithful to one's deepest truth, that is, authenticity of life, overflows into prophecy. The prophet acts as a catalyst who moves others toward embracing and living out the highest levels of a nonviolent and charitable ethical life. In Raids on the Unspeakable, Merton reflects, quote, to prophesy is not to predict, but to seize upon reality in its moment of highest expectation and tension toward the new, end of quote. To prophesy is to perceive with the eyes of imagination, that is, the spiritual eye, as Blake noted. It is to herald God's kingdom of life in the midst of the kingdom of death. As a prophet of peace and voice of conscience, Thomas Merton stressed that Christians must own their complicity in acquiescing to and or promoting social structures founded in deception and or oppression. In his work, Faith and Violence, Merton asserts, quote, the real challenge of Christianity today is above all the recovery of a creative and prophetic iconoclasm over against the idols of power and super control, end of quote. Prophet Merton challenges Christians and non-Christians alike to be and act in solidarity with persons victimized by such idolatries as violence in general and racism, war, and nuclearism in particular. According to Merton, now is the acceptable time. Now is the hour of prophecy. Prophecy is both gift and responsibility, blessing and burden. Taking up the cross and crown of prophecy is intrinsic to Christian discipleship. For Thomas Merton, it is in and through the prophet's unmasking and shattering idols that Jesus' kingdom of love, peace, and justice is enabled to continue in today's world. Finally, it's noteworthy that in a letter to Jean Leclerc, OSB, several months before Merton died, Merton wrote, the vocation of the monk in our modern world is not survival, but prophecy. Throughout his life as a Trappist monk, but especially during the last decade of his life, Thomas Merton's prophetic vision, though for the most part misunderstood and originally suppressed by leaders of his monastic community, in his day offered a clarion call regarding violence, racism, warfare, and nuclearism, and today continues to challenge humankind, for whom unbridled violence and the possibility of global nuclear obliteration poses an imminent threat in our world. That, ladies and gentlemen, was my introduction. What I'm going to do next is talk about these various strains of propheticness of Merton. I want to talk about, first of all, nonviolence. In the 1960s, Merton became a prophetic voice of protest against all forms of violence. He declared, "By being in the monastery, I take my true part in the struggles and sufferings of our world." To adopt a life that is essentially nonviolent, a life of humility and peace, in itself is a statement of one's position. It is my intention to make my entire life a rejection of and protest against the crimes and injustices of war and political tyranny, which threaten to destroy the whole human race and the world with it. During the last years of his life, Merton spent his energies writing about peace and nonviolence. In developing an ethic of nonviolence, he adopted Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, that is, soul or love force, that always attempts to overcome evil by good, anger by love, untruth by truth. For Gandhi, nonviolence is an orientation to life based on the conviction that love is the deepest human power. Concurring with this teaching, Merton asserted that to live nonviolently is to proclaim by one's life the supreme efficacy of love. In his study of Gandhi's writings, Merton became convinced that nonviolence is a power superior to the forces of brutality in the world, and that this power will ultimately be victorious over all forms of violence and deception. From Gandhi's life and writings, Merton also gleaned the insight that human rights, including those of one's oppressor, deserve respect. During the early years of his writing career, Thomas Merton wrote extensively about contemplation. Just as his study of Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha contributed to his development of an ethic of nonviolence, so too did Merton's reflections on contemplation enable him to better comprehend what it means to embrace a lifelong commitment to peacemaking. For Merton, contemplation and nonviolence are inherently related. He defines contemplation as, quote, the deep, intimate knowledge of God by a union of love. The deep and intimate knowledge of God by a union of love. Contemplation entails discovering the fountain of the living water of love, God, welling up inside oneself. Through the school of love, that is contemplation, one enters profoundly into the mystery of God's love for oneself and for others. In his writings, Merton stresses that contemplation cleanses the soul. It facilitates reverence for and harmony with all that exists. In the solitude of contemplation, one comes in contact with the peaceful wellspring of God's great silence. One rests in God, who is truth, hidden wholeness, and becomes aware of one's true place in our world. For Merton, nonviolence flows out of the experience of contemplation. Our deep awareness that we are truly at one with everything and everyone in the hidden ground of love we call God demands of us, Merton writes, that we live in nonviolent love. In essence, contemplative awareness leads to the realization that one is called to practice nonviolent love for all one's fellow human beings and all the rest of creation, with whom one is united in and through God. In his writings, Merton emphasizes that the true contemplative person seeks to integrate a life of contemplation and action. Love is the hinge that unites action and contemplation. Merton reflects, action is charity looking outward to others. Contemplation is charity drawn inward to its divine source. In his writings, Merton stresses that the socially responsible contemplative person prayerfully and prophetically critiques the violence of war, the war machine, bombs, racism, and poverty, physical and spiritual poverty in our world. The contemplative person issues an emphatic no to human society bent on violence. Regarding this, Merton notes that each one of us has to resist an ingrained tendency to violence and to destructive thinking. Living nonviolently for Thomas Merton is the great prophetic Christian witness for our time. Merton viewed racism as an obvious sign of the crisis of violence prevalent in the United States during his lifetime. He described the Black civil rights movement in our country as one of the most positive and successful expressions of Christian social action seen anywhere, according to Merton, in the 20th century. His sensitivity to the reality of the oppressive situation of African Americans in 20th century America grew out of Merton's experience in 1940 of working at Catherine de Hawk Doherty's Friendship House in Harlem. There, Merton gained keen insight into the patience with which at that time African Americans endured a deprived and exploited existence. For Merton, the struggle for Black liberation in our country is linked to Gandhi's Satyagraha, truth or soul force. He wrote, quote, "The African American children of Birmingham who walked calmly up to the police dogs that lunged at them with a fury capable of tearing their small bodies to pieces were not only confronting the truth in an exalted moment of faith, a providential kairos, they were also in their simplicity bearing heroic Christian witness to the truth. They were exposing their bodies to death in order to show God and humans that they believed in the just rights of their people, knew that those rights had been unjustly, shamefully, and systematically violated, and realized that the violation called for expiation and redemptive protest because it was an offense against God and God's truth." In writings on racism, Merton stresses that in our country, whites historically enslaved blacks in inferiority and powerlessness by imposing economic and social degradation upon them. He notes that in various periods of American history, white Americans conceived of African Americans as subservient and subhuman, non-persons. Over time, the deep-seated sin of racial prejudice ate away, as Merton says, like a cancer in our society. Within this disgraceful situation, African Americans offered a message of salvation to their white oppressors by refusing to accept evil of iniquity and injustice against them. They sought to awaken their fellow Americans' consciences to the need to reform society according to the norm of Christian love. The elimination of racism in our country, according to Merton, requires that white persons experience a profound change of heart, a real shake-up, he says, and deep-reaching metanoia. There's a need for white Americans to repent of their lamentable injustices and cruelties to their brothers and sisters, African Americans. According to Merton, there is no racial division in Christ. All are equal. So, white persons and black persons need to reach out to each other, become sisters and brothers in the fullest sense of the word. And only by doing so, according to Merton, is there the possibility of eliminating racism in our country. Merton had a tremendous admiration for Dr. Martin Luther King. He applauded King's philosophy of nonviolence in the struggle against racial prejudice in our country. He described King as a courageous and edifying Christian who grounded his thinking and actions in Christ's law of love, which Merton believed and King believed would unite people, enemies, in truth. Like Merton, King was influenced by the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, Satyagraha. I think we know enough about King for me to move on here. King really did say, and he lived this out, that non-retaliatory suffering is redemptive and transformative. Nonviolence begins in the heart of a person who chooses love, expresses it in his or her actions, including love of one's enemy. Now, because of embracing this philosophy of nonviolence, King himself suffered tremendously, as probably we all know. During his public ministry, there were periods of imprisonment, multiple death threats. When a bomb threatened his family at their home, it exploded on the porch in 1956. His wife, Coretta, almost died because of this bombing, and their 2-month-old daughter, Yolanda, experienced this bombing. In the wake of this entirely shocking event, Dr. King urged an angry crowd of his followers to choose nonviolence, to put away their guns. That was King's response to the violence that he experienced at his home. Dr. King, as you know, talked about the beloved community, the community wherein all of us have deep respect for each other. We recognize our worth as human beings. When King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1963, part of his statement including this: sooner or later, he said, all the people of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace. If this is to be achieved, people must evolve from all human conflict a method which rejects aggression, retaliation. This is the foundation. Rejection of revenge, aggression, retaliation, it's the method of love. In a letter to Ping Ferry, who became a really good friend of Thomas Merton later in Merton's life, Merton depicted Dr. King's receiving the Nobel Peace Prize as one of the greatest things that has happened in recent years. When the 39-year-old Dr. King was assassinated, Merton expressed his deep hope that his friend's death would stir the conscience of people in our country in a profound way. He wrote a touching letter to Dr. King's wife, Coretta. He eulogized Dr. King by declaring, he's done the greatest thing anyone can do. In imitation of his master, he laid down his life for his friends and enemies. He will go down in history as one of our greatest citizens. That's part of the quote from the letter of Merton to Coretta. In the 1960s, Thomas Merton became a staunch proponent of the abolition of war. He declared, I feel now perfectly convinced that there's one task for me that takes precedence over everything else, working with such means as I have at my disposal for the abolition of war. Merton believed that this same task was a moral obligation incumbent on the entire human race, since in his opinion, any war, listen to this, could eventuate in a nuclear war. Does that sound like we're thinking like that today? Yes. And then he goes on to say, it could lead to a nuclear holocaust. Isn't that our great fear? with the Ukrainian war. When all is said and done, I'm inserting that. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. He was concerned that we could have a nuclear holocaust, which would end civilization as we know it. He prophetically asserted, and I quote, "There can be no question," he said, "that unless war is abolished, the world will remain constantly in a state of madness and desperation in which, because of the immense destructive power of modern weapons, the danger of catastrophe will be imminent and probable at every moment, everywhere." That's Merton speaking prophetically, I think, to our time. He contended that the way to begin the international journey to lasting peace was to develop a program of gradual multilateral disarmament of nations through nonviolent negotiations. In this way, according to Merton, rather than continuing to budget billions and billions of dollars to secure more and more caches of armaments, the world nations could monetarily ensure the global population access to food, medicine, housing, education needed to live decent lives. Let me turn now to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Merton wrote an incredible prose poem. Anyone heard of this? Original Child Bomb. It's incredible. It is so starkly factual that it hits you between your eyeballs. He narrates in this poem the United States bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II, the consequent wholesale decimation of the inhabitants of those two cities. Through its bombing operation, the U.S. vaporized 130,000 Japanese citizens in Hiroshima. That's a fact. 30,000 people in Nagasaki. For Thomas Merton, the bombing of these two cities violated the just war theory, since civilians were the primary victims of this atrocity. Does that sound contemporary with what's happening in Ukraine? Yes, it does. According to Merton, quote, "The idea was to unleash the maximum destructive power on a civilian center, to obliterate that center and destroy all other will to resist in the Japanese nation." Right here I'd insert, look what Putin with his war is doing in Ukraine today. This same type of philosophy. In a letter to Honorable Shinsu Hamai, the mayor of Hiroshima, after the bombing, Merton wrote, "I never cease to face the truth, which is symbolized in the names Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each day I pray humbly and with love for the victims of the atomic bombardments which took place there. All the holy spirits of those who lost their lives there I regard as my dear friends, my real friends. I express my fraternal and humble love for all the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki." Now, Fortune magazine, post-war, World War II, reported on a questionnaire conducted. And Merton is quoting about this. He says, "It revealed that half of the respondents felt that the decision to use the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been right, while nearly a quarter of the people who were part of this, who responded to the questionnaire, regretted that more atomic bombs were not used on these Japanese cities." Well, Merton turns to Vietnam and that war. He has a lot to say about that. He saw this as one of the worst blunders in United States history. That's what he says. It was an atrocity, Merton thought. It involved the callous ravaging of human life and the rape of the culture of Vietnam, all with the goal of trying to save Vietnam. This is a quote that I find profound from Merton regarding this war. He says, "Are we so psychologically constituted and determined that we find real comfort in a daily score of bombed bridges and burned villages, forgetting that the price of our psychological security is the burned flesh of women and children who have no guilt and no escape from the fury of our weapons? We believe that any end can be achieved from the moment one possesses the right instruments, the right machines, the right technique. The problem of war turns into a problem of engineering. We forget that we are dealing with human beings instead of rocks, steel, oil, water, coal." In his writings, Merton notes that the U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it exploded during World War II. More bombs on Vietnam than we exploded during World War II. He said he was on the side, I quote, of the burned, cut to pieces, tortured, held as hostages, gassed, ruined, destroyed people in what he called a futile, brutal war. I turn now to the nuclear specter. In his lifetime, in Merton's lifetime, we possess in this country a stockpile of nuclear weapons estimated at 60,000 megatons. Without taking into consideration the nuclear caches of other nations in our global community, this alone was enough to wipe out civilization and destroy life on planet Earth. So Merton prophetically insists that in this context, the moral imperative of the international community is to rid itself of these weapons of mass destruction and stop building new ones. He asserts, quote, "to allow governments to pour more and more billions into weapons that almost immediately become obsolete, therefore necessitating more billions for newer and bigger weapons, is one of the most colossal injustices in the long history of humankind. While we are doing this," he writes, "2/3 of our world, the people of the world, are starving or living in conditions of subhuman destitution." Now, in the case of nuclear war, Thomas Merton maintains that the conditions for a just war are not applicable. I quote for Merton, "A war of total annihilation simply cannot be considered a just war, no matter how good the cause for which it is undertaken. Nuclear war would be a moral evil second only to the crucifixion." That's what he said. A moral evil second only to the crucifixion. It would lead to the suicide of nations, he writes, and the wholesale disappearance of human culture. Merton encouraged Christians to not engage in any job that would contribute to the making of nuclear weapons. He was deeply disturbed by what he viewed as the lack of anti-nuclear sentiment evidenced by church leaders in his day. In a letter addressed by Merton to Dorothy Day, they were good friends. In 1961, Merton said, "But why this awful silence and apathy on the part of Catholics, clergy, hierarchy, lay people on this terrible issue on which the very continued existence of humankind depends?" He wrote a similar letter to Ernesto Cardenal. Quote, "I do not criticize, but I observe with a kind of numb silence the inaction, the passivity, the apparent indifference and incomprehension with which most Catholics, clergy, laity, at least in this country, watch the development of pressures that build up to a nuclear war." I wonder if that's something that challenges us at this moment in our history. He wrote Cold War letters in 1961. There were 111 of these letters. He was forced to become silent publication-wise, so he resorted to letters to friends. Of course, this has been published posthumously, so you can get a copy of his Cold War letters today, but you couldn't even touch it. It was all mimeographed. His Dom James allowed him to do this, even though the general superior of the Trappists said no. to any kind of publications, but since this was not real publication, it happened. His letters evidence the fact that he was struggling with the imminent threat of nuclear holocaust. In one of his letters, he writes, "This awful issue of nuclear war, what concerns me is the ghastly feeling that we are all on the brink of a spiritual defection and betrayal of Christ, which would consist in the complete acceptance of the values and the decisions of the callous people of war, who think only in terms of megacorpses and megatons, and have not the slightest thought of human beings, the images of God." The presence of nuclear weapons intruded personally on Merton's life when a SAC plane, Strategic Air Command plane, flew over his hermitage on the property at the Abbey of Gethsemane. He observed, "I've seen the SAC plane with the bomb in it fly low over me and have looked up out of the woods directly at the closed bay of the metal bird with a scientific egg in its breast. A womb easily and mechanically opened. I do not consider this technological mother to be the friend of anything I believe in." Well, I walked us through the various parts I want to consider, and now I want to conclude and then open this to discussion. I have a handout that we might look at, but we'll see what happens. I, of course, have collapsed a lot of this. During the final 3 years of his life, for the most part in his cinder block hermitage, but of course he went to Asia for his final trip, and that was his final trip because he died in Asia through electrocution, we believe. A faulty fan. He reverently, in this hermitage, cinder block hermitage, where I have spent time myself, it's a wonderful little place. He reverently and contemplatively engaged in simple activities, such as walking. Simple activities like walking, eating, sleeping, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, bringing in wood for the fireplace, praying, lots of praying, enjoying the fragrance of darkness when the sun set and became dark there on the hill where the hermitage still sits. When daylight showed itself, he loved to be awakened by the dawn, to watch the dawn come into being. A recreation, he said, a new day. And rain was the language of God for him. And of course, the roof of the hermitage is metal. And whenever rain comes there, you really hear it really well. These were simple rituals that enabled Thomas Merton to awaken more deeply, I believe, to life, to the harmony of life, and to become, in these circumstances, a prophet of peace, a prophet of nonviolence, because he was living nonviolently in his hermitage. For Prophet Thomas Merton, as I've already said, for him, the moral imperative of our time is to sow seeds of nonviolence in our world. It is to treat each person with reverence. This is not something you don't know. We all know this. He's reminding us of this. It is, he says, not to allow anger, and who among us doesn't have angry moments? I know I do, especially in the car. I get impatient. He said we are not to allow anger, hatred, resentment. It's hard to get rid of resentment, I think, especially if you've really been hurt by someone. It takes time, it takes prayer, it takes a lot. He says that we should not allow ourselves to allow these things to linger in our hearts. Of course, the foundation for not lingering in our hearts is that God is with us, and God will help us to get through our resentments. and hatreds and anger. I'm speaking for Merton now. I know he would agree. For Merton, all of this is to embrace love. He goes back to Gandhi, the force of love, satyagraha. Love, truth force. This is the power that we have. This is the power that refuses to retaliate in the face and provocation of violence. And of course, he's thinking about Dr. Martin Luther King, who did just this. He did not retaliate in the face of violence against him and his people. For Merton, it's all about envisioning a world freed of racism. When will that happen? A world free of war. When will that happen? I'm adding these things. A world free of nuclearism. When? And of course, it's all with the goal of we're becoming brothers and sisters in our global community, the beloved community of Dr. King, Martin Luther King, so that we could join hands across all geographical spaces in our global community, and we could learn to live together in peace, nonviolently, justly, lovingly. This is his vision as a prophet of peace. That's all there is. Meaning that's all there really should be. All right, so before I pass out this handout, which we could look at a little bit, I would like to open this to any comments, thoughts, questions, insights. I know I gave you a lot. In some ways, this sounds Pollyannish, doesn't it? Can we ever have a world where there's not violence? I just spent some time in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm from. Racism is alive and well there. And there's always in the news every night another report of violence against an African American person. Every night you hear about this. In the face of that, I say, well, is this Pollyannish? Is Merton right? I think he is right. He is right. The challenge is true. But how to bring this about in our world community, well, that's another thing. Extremely difficult. There's always war and there's a rumor of war. Would you know that is truth in your life? It's been true in mine. And maybe we have veterans of war here too. If we do, maybe his words really are painful for you to hear. You know what I'm saying? No, because he's saying no war. And you may have invested yourself in keeping freedom alive in the United States through your service in one of our armed forces. Who knows? I'm not asking you to reveal that, but it could be true. I myself have relatives who served in our nation's military. And we hail them, we thank them for their service. So in some ways, this sounds sort of contradictory. You know what I'm saying there? But I think there's truth in what Merton is saying. Otherwise, I wouldn't speak it. But are there any questions? Well, do we have one?
Not really. One of the things, I don't know if I can get this to work. Battery may have died. So if I can borrow this just a moment.
Why don't you borrow this?
Thank you. One of the things, a lot of the things that we do seem to be self-contradictory. In fact, when you have a chance to look through our booklet that we prepared for this week, we have a chaplain coming in from the armed forces. And our goal there is relatively simple. In the light of what you talked about, it becomes perhaps a question for him as well. Where are you and where are we in terms of doing that? A lot of it, I think we do I imagine, without thinking, without connecting those kind of things in it. But it'll be an interesting question to ask Reverend Demon, who's going to be here a little bit later this week. One of my purposes in terms of scheduling him was a little bit different, just simple practical thing. We're Catholic, and we need to deepen our knowledge about others. I think some of this that you talk about, you need to know. You need to know the other person. And I think one of the things that impressed me about that and caused me to invite this individual was the fact that how does someone of one faith service those of other faith? How does he take on that role in all of those differences? Now, this individual that's coming in is an Anglican priest. Prior to that, I had a Baptist scheduled, but he wasn't able to make it. He got another assignment, and that fell through. But in essence in there, he will service Catholics as a chaplain, Buddhists, followers of Muhammad, even witchcraft, which exists in the military. He will do small services for all of them. He will not say Mass, obviously, but he will service them. So there has to be that kind of a bond, and maybe there is something that unites it in terms of that, in that individual that is able to do these things. If that can cross those boundaries, then, there's an element of hope. So in all of that contradiction of having a chaplain who will then pray for our troops, obviously, may the best team win? No, we want our team to win, clearly. So I don't know what the prayer is. Is it a prayer to St. Michael that makes it all good? Because he's a saint, and okay, after we said it, we can just relieve ourselves of the responsibility. I don't know about those questions, but in essence in there, as I say, it gives us food for thought in terms of another individual who'll be here.
I want to respond to that and say that for Thomas Merton, although I have talked about his thinking on nuclear war and what he said about Vietnam, he was not opposed to the just war theory, if you understand what that is. And in the case of Ukraine, I would like to just say what I think Merton would say. The response to unprovoked attack on a people by a foreign power, in this case, Putin and Russians. The just war theory allows what's happening in Ukraine today, the response of the international community. That in this case, one needs to defend one's life, in this case, democracy in that country. And so we have a just war going on, according to Thomas Merton, because it's a defensive war. And there's no desire of the Ukrainian leader and the people. They're not into destruction. They're being destroyed. And they are trying to respond in a defensive way. And the international community, especially the United States, is offering them weaponry to help this happen. So even though Merton speaks against weapons, he speaks also in favor of a just war theory, and in this case, I believe Ukraine is that. I think he would say that. I know he would say that. Now, he believed, however, as I said in this lecture, this presentation, that any war can escalate, he thought, into a nuclear war. Any war today. I think that's the fear that exists within us. We don't want that to happen as a human community because we know what would happen if it does happen. Civilization as we know it would not continue. So he is very adamant in his writings about the possibility of nuclear holocaust. And is trying to help people to see that that's exactly what we don't want. We need to be prophetic against it because we want our human community to continue in its existence. And it is not God's will that we employ nuclear weapons to destroy our civilization. I wanted to say that because that's very important to what I've been saying. Do we have any further comments? Yes. We might need that microphone. Or I don't know how you can.
Where we're going in the last few years and how it seems that intolerance is growing and the anger is growing and the retribution is growing. You know, where is that coming from and how possibly can non-violently people conquer those things? That, you know, I'm kind of thinking more locally rather than globally. I don't know what you could speak to that.
Yes. Last night on the news, we learned about some of our Muslim brothers and sisters attacked. It seemed like no one was killed, but a lot of people were injured. Over the summer, we've heard all kinds of things. The supermarkets, where all of a sudden you're simply doing your grocery shopping, and what happens is that you can get shot at and killed because someone has a gun. Guns, you know, we are living in an extremely violent society in this country, I believe. That's why I think Merton's speaking to us about trying to be nonviolent in our own personal lives is very important. Because if we can't become nonviolent in our own personal lives, it'll never work in our local community. But we seem to have an incredible crisis of violence going on right now. Would you agree? And what to do about it? Well, because there's also, let me put it this way, such political divisiveness in this country. Would you agree to that? Yes. Okay, so we are extremely divided politically in this country. Well, one of the ways to approach this and it's already happening, it's just a small thing, but people are coming together in circles and they're talking about their differences and they're finding out there's commonality within their differences. But this is nonviolent conversation people are engaging in. It's not predominant, but it's happening in different cities with the hope that somehow it'll make a difference. But Merton was not providing answers, he was raising questions. And I think we're left with the questions. And what do I do in my personal life? How do I respond to the students in front of me, for example, every year? These young college students. I try to be as gentle and understanding of their situations as at all possible. You see what I'm saying? I try to be with them, and they're growing up, as it were. You know, and sometimes I just shake my head as like, why don't you know this already? But they don't. I'm just giving a simple example of how I try to live this out peacefully in my situation, but we all have to ask that question, I think. And this is not easy work. This is hard, I think. That's what I think. It really is difficult to live nonviolently. I think there are strains of violence in every one of us. What do you think? You think you live totally nonviolently? I don't think I do. And so I need to pay attention to that. And in contemplative prayer, I need to address that with God and see what I can do to change that in my life. This is how Merton speaks to me. He speaks to me so immensely, I can't get out of Merton. I never will. I never will, probably. Can't wait to meet him in heaven. assuming that's where I'll be. Okay, so, go ahead. I don't know, I mean, that's all I could do with that. I mean, really, okay.
You mentioned that we are living through a time of great political divisiveness in this country. That divisiveness persists also in the church, in the Catholic Church. And I was wondering if you could comment on how Merton would come to terms with that, what he would do to alleviate it.
Well, okay. Right away came to mind the pedophilia situation, which does not go away. And if Merton were alive, I think he'd be aghast that that has gone on. That the way priests have been shuffled from one place to another, cover-ups. It's not the way. That's not the way of truth. That's not satyagraha. That's not truth force. That's an evil, a cancer in the community. It's being addressed. It has been being addressed. But it seems like this pedophilia, it just rears its angry head. It's not angry, but its head every once in a while when we think it's kind of taken care of, but it's not. So I think he would be very, very much appalled that that's been going on. That's one thing. What else is going on in the church that he would attend to? Well, Pope Francis did make a public statement about the war in Ukraine. He kind of held back for a while, didn't he? Finally came up with something that is good to hear, seeking peaceful negotiations, if that's all going to be possible with Putin and the president of Ukraine. But anyway, we have a pope that's, well, he's controversial in himself. There are people on both sides of the aisle about the way he works. You know, LGBTQ, that seems to be an issue that he wants to have non-judgment about. And yet we have in the Catholic Church the official teaching, which is against marriage of people who are gays, lesbians, etc. Again, there's such contradiction in all this. And there are people on both sides of the aisles about that too, aren't there? Catholics who say marriage should be available to people who are homosexual. And then there are other people who say, no, that's not the teaching of the church. We have to uphold that completely. So I don't know. There's divisiveness also. I'm just pointing out some of what I see. You may have other examples. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know if I've read a lot of Merton, but I don't remember him addressing those issues.
Oh, he didn't. I didn't mean to. I thought you meant. Oh, okay. If you thought I was speaking out of what he wrote, no, I wasn't. I'm speaking out of what I think he might think about these issues today. He wouldn't be happy with all this divisiveness at all. And yet he became a divisive figure through his prophetic writings and speaking, even within his community.
To that, how he was suppressed to some extent, how much so?
Well, when the letter came from the Trappist General Superior, Dom James didn't make it available to Merton. He held it back. He wanted Merton to be able to get some more of his writings out, especially about war and nuclearism. And so he allowed that. And then finally he had to tell him that here's the letter and this is what this means. Now Merton was very convinced that his vow of obedience was something that he would always follow in his life as a Trappist. So if the general is saying I can't publish, then I don't publish. It wasn't easy. It was hard for him to accept that. But then it was Dom James who came up with this alternative of the Cold War letters. So interesting, his own superior at that level is trying to figure out a way for Merton to keep the voice of propheticness going without publishing to the world.
So that's curious because his hero, Martin Luther King, was the icon of civil disobedience. So he figures that Merton could have followed his lead on that as well.
Right. That's a very good insight. And he did what he could as a monk. Being a monk was extremely important to him. Even so, when he had the affair with M, about which I've published an article, he struggled deeply with that because for the first time in his life, he really, really deeply fell in love with someone. And he was trying to figure out how he could incorporate this into his life as a monk. And she was trying to figure this out too with him. And finally, he's the one who said, well, they agreed, no, this can't go on. And he was forced, under the vow of obedience, again, to make a decision. The abbot said, okay, I get it. You're in love, and that's a good thing, but you're a monk. And you're going to have to make a choice here. Either continue as a monk or don't. Was that black and white? And Merton is like, whoa, wow. And finally he came to a point where he agreed in writing to be a hermit for the rest of his life. Not necessarily at the Abbey of Gethsemane, where he was now in a hermitage. And this all happened while he was in this hermitage, falling in love with this woman. Anyway, the vow of obedience is seemingly uppermost in his life, ultimately. And isn't that interesting? Because there's a certain contradiction to that too, because he's politically disobedient, if it were. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, his life is full of contradictions. And he says, that's who I am. All right. Okay. Does anybody else have a thought? Yes. And I'm going to hand this out to you before we leave here. We're past time.
Thank you for bringing these to the forefront again, some of the thinking of Thomas Merton. I think it's important for us to keep bringing these kind of things into the current conversation, because the current conversation, the current experience, not only in the United States, we talk about division in the United States. I live now in Italy. It's just as divisive there. It's just that they don't have the media that publishes it as well as we do here. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is going on in many countries around the world. This is a tone that's around the world. In that you said something about the young that you teach, and you wonder why they haven't learned this. And I guess I would question, maybe more of a comment, is we create good students, we do not create scholars in our educational systems anymore. We create people who are able, they're smarter, we have new technologies, but I wonder if we're wiser. If we've gone to understand and study the real values of the person, the real values that move society. And I think because we become superficial, and we don't get to really sit down and talk about these things and to discuss where is this going. You know, when we talk about the racism in this country, but the racism in this country is even bigger in South America. Mm-hmm. But again, we don't hear about it because we're busy consumed in our own little worlds. And so we need to find a way to break this, to look at how we learn, how we study. And I always work with little maybe cliches or statements. And when I worked with high school kids, I used to share this. And one of them that I used to give them, I said, the opposite of love, and for Merton, love was key. But what do we understand about love? Because the church teaches something about love. And then it seems contradictory in how it lives out that experience of love in its teaching. And so, but the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Hmm.
And I believe if we begin to understand what the fears are, we begin to move in a new direction of understanding. For example, what is it that Putin fears?
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
What is this contradiction of war, but don't escalate to nuclear war, but if I'm afraid eventually the war is going to come home, I need to find a way to protect myself. So my fear is that eventually all my armaments are not going to be big enough. I have to. So all of a sudden we're building on these fears, and that becomes the barrier to love. So I think finding ways to begin to talk about that, they get to the root of what's going on. There's a hope. I think these discussion groups that you talked about, and I hear about this all over in different places. People are attempting to do this, and I think these are good things. But how do we get it to grow?
Yes, thank you for that. And I wanted to mention Nelson Mandela. After 27 years in imprisonment, he was released, and he became the president of South Africa. And apartheid was the whole reason that he was imprisoned. And he, as president, developed a process of reconciliation in the country. Now, it hasn't been foolproof, but not 100%. But this whole process of bringing people together around the question of apartheid, oppression of South African blacks by whites, this is the process that, in my opinion, is being lived out somewhat in this country now, United States, with these groups of people coming together in a non-judgmental, open forum. Your beliefs, your beliefs, your beliefs, your beliefs. Let's listen and find out what our differences are and some of our similarities. And this is a way to promote nonviolent living. Well, I'm going to give this to everybody, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking comments and your lecture today. I take it this is homework? I see.
Okay. One of the courses that I teach at the college is a seminar on the writings of Thomas Merton. And so this would be something that I would have compiled for my students in the seminar. So I thought, since I was talking about Merton on nuclear war, I'd give you this. The last page, I think, gives you all the places where I found all these quotes. So this is my compilation of this. You can't find it anywhere else. It's something that I did for my students in the course. And by the way, in that particular seminar, we had incredible conversations about all kinds of things that Merton has to talk about. So it's been a wonderful experience with theology majors at the college. And not only majors, other students get interested in this and become a part of the seminar. So this is just one little handout from that particular seminar that I thought you might want to look at and think about. So thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
I offered Sister Marilyn an opportunity to have dinner with us, but as it turned out, I was kind of late in asking.
Yes, I already have plans. I'm sorry, but...
Yeah, well,
life.
It would have been a good date, but if you have another, that's fine.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
We are going to be meeting again.